Welcome to At Home at Highclere for Viking.TV on a Friday, and we're beginning today in the secret garden. It is the most magical, long, herbaceous walk. It was used in Downton Abbey. Actually, it was often pretending to be Maggie Smith's garden, Dowager Countess of Grantham, her house was theoretically elsewhere, but in fact, it was here. There were many wonderful scenes, but in real life, it gives Geordie and I such pleasure, and I hope all of our visitors. Do you want to share with them where it came from, where the idea came from?
This garden was conceived in the 1960s by my grandfather when he was living here at Highclere, and he got a guy called Jim Russell to design it. And Jim Russell was a great plantsman and garden designer who lived at Castle Howard in the north of England. And he made this glorious secret garden with these serpentine winding paths you see around here. And they give an optical illusion of really rather more length and space than there really is. Because in fact it's rather a cosy and glorious environment for a lovely garden you can enjoy of a nice spring morning or afternoon.
That's completely true. There's still quite a lot of weeding. He may say it's cosy and not that big, but there's still quite a lot of work. Behind me you can see some cherry trees which still have some blossom. And all around us there are so many birds. There is so much bird song. And I think in this particular time I'm ever more aware of it. Geordie and I have really developed some of the spring flowers which visitors can normally in most years enjoy here, and I hope some of you might come and visit us. Some tulips. My husband tends to choose some of the bulbs and I tend to choose some of the shrubs, and then together we try to create interest throughout the entire year. But of course now it's towards the end of April. The tulips are just about going over, but they're a wonderful shape and wonderful colour.
Every autumn I have my wonderful moment with the catalogue, looking through, trying to get the colour combinations right, and whether they come out early April, end of March, or whether they last on into May, the single ones, double ones, the rather sort of glorious mixtures of everything. They're a fascinating bulb to work with. And of course later on we have wonderful peonies where you can see all the green coming now, and they're great in June and early July.
You can see to one side of us, we'll show you some shots later on, the south wall of the monk's garden. It's a very old wall. There was a monk's garden here, certainly in 1216 and perhaps in the previous century. And there's now what we call a gate to the secret garden, which we'll also share with you later. And on the other side of this particular walk is a beech hedge, which we've extended in one direction, and beyond it, again for the future, is an area called the Wood of Goodwill. And it's a collection of different native trees and trees planted because they were given to us by friends, or trees we've planted to remember great friendships. So we're going to walk on down here, and then with the cameras you can follow us and see some of the different planting schemes and escape into a wonderful garden for a short time.
Lots of delphiniums here on the right for later. Nice bunch of roses here for later in July and August. There's this ornamental cherry which is still blossoming with its wonderful white blossom. These rather blousy tulips here, all opening out in the sunny warmth of the day. And then behind this bench here, which looks not much now, we have this fantastic collection of our famous hydrangea Annabelle, which totally surrounds us with these enormous white balls of flowers later on in July and August, and they last into early September.
And this was also a bench where Maggie Smith sat, so such fame. But it's also a bench where I think Freya and Stella very much like sitting and having a little bit of a pat and shaking hands. So, I hope you've enjoyed our little walk through the gardens. And we're now going to return back to the house and share some stories about the parkland beyond the gardens inside. Thank you. And you can come sit here too. Well, thank you so much for joining us at home at Highclere for Viking.TV, and I really hope you enjoyed the part we shared with you in the gardens. George and I love the gardens, and we hope that in the years to come the visitors will thoroughly enjoy coming to see them again. I was joined by Alfie and Scooby. Can you come back, Alfie, Scooby? Two wonderful Labradors, two boys. Alfie, the darker one, has a predilection for checking out every bin, and Scooby, the lighter one, has yet again eaten another loaf of bread this afternoon, so I'm not sure which is the better one at the moment, but they're adorable and they're great friends to have. Will you sit down, please? Sit, both of you sit down, so I know where you are. Well, what I thought I'd do today is move from beyond the gardens, which occupy the area down the slope to the south of the castle, and they sort of wrap round the landscape beneath the lawns, and move back from that to tell you some stories about the park. Because the castle is a beautiful building, one I love, but it sits above all in the most amazing setting. It sits in 1,000 acres of Countess Brown landscape, Countess Brown park landscape. And this man, Countess Brown, was an 18th century, magician in some ways. He completely transformed the face of 18th century landscape in this country. He created rivers where there were none, lakes where there were none. He created hills, he created views, and he blocked others off. He moved trees and planted trees, and wrapping a park around aristocratic houses, and if the houses were less magnificent, creating a magnificent setting for them. So if you were an aristocrat in 18th century England, you wanted Countess Brown to create the park around your house. During his lifetime, he perhaps created 174 extraordinary parks, worlds apart, places to wonder and admire, to think about nature, to go for walks and to go on horseback, to find the menageries, the walled gardens, and a sense of peace and a sense of place. Countess Brown was born the fifth of 6 children in Kirkhale in Northumberland in 1716. So a few years ago we celebrated his tercentenary, and we celebrated with a week of talks here at Highclere. When he was 23, he travelled south because his family had found him a job at Kiddington in Oxfordshire, and at 23 he began his first apprenticeship creating a garden. A few years later, he was lucky enough to be offered a job by Lord Cobham, and he went to work at Stowe. And Stowe was one of the most remarkable landscape gardens of that century. It was the work of decades of many different gardeners, and perhaps above all is associated with William Kent. When Lord Cobham died in 1749, Countess Brown, Lancelot Brown, had to begin to find another role, another job. And whilst he was at Stowe, he had become particularly good at networking. It's not a new phenomenon. He was very good at networking in the 18th century, and he developed relationships with a number of patrons. So he set himself up in business himself. He lived in Hammersmith on a house overlooking the River Thames, and I often think that perhaps seeing that great river flow up and down all his life when he was at home must have influenced him, so that every single house where he created a park, he was also creating a body of water, a lake such as at Highclere, or perhaps a river and a lake such as at somewhere like Blenheim. So his story begins in 1751, and it's a fascinating time in terms of landscape architecture. In London at the time were Bridgman, George London, Switzer, Stephen Switzer, and they had taken on and developed the formality of the French landscapes and taken it into a more naturalistic setting. The century before, and over the 50 years before Countess Brown really, it was the French who dominated the landscape. Much more formal, much more intricate. It actually was much more expensive to maintain and required masses of gardens. Think of Versailles, and that was developed by an amazing man called Le Nôtre. So we went from the formality of Le Nôtre into the naturalistic, romantic, more in tune with nature landscapes of England, and above all of Countess Brown. So although it was naturalistic, much of what he developed at Highclere was actually created by him. So that's what's so interesting. One of the key men with whom Countess Brown developed his trade was a man called William Kent. and he was very influential in London and creating the gardens and some of the interior decoration at Kensington Palace. So we're talking about the time of George III and later on George IV. One of K.B.T. Brown's first commissions was actually at Petworth, and that's interesting for Highclere because it was in about 1751. And later on, Lord Carnarvon, as he was, the first Earl of Carnarvon, married the daughter of Lord Egremont, who lived at Petworth. So he was interested in what his father-in-law had created and wanted to do it himself. We know a lot about what K.B.T. Brown did because of bank statements, because in 1753, K.B.T. Brown opened a bank account with Drummond's Bank. So from those bank records, we know who his clients were, what he did and how much he charged. And there's a wonderful document later on which is about all the bills that the first Earl of Carnarvon was charged for K.B.T. Brown's plans. So a little bit later, in 1771, K.B.T. Brown was commissioned by Colonel Henry Herbert to become the first Earl of Carnarvon to create a beautiful park here at Highclere. And at that time, when K.B.T. Brown arrived, he arrived in front of a red brick place house. It was L-shaped, it faced south, and it was a more formal landscape, a smaller landscape, a tessellated landscape, and K.B.T. Brown was going to come along and break up the tessellation to create this naturalistic planting all around the house. So the small fields, the agricultural fields and everything else were going to be swept away, and the house was going to stand in the middle of its own. So the first thing, as I mentioned, that the first Earl of Carnarvon got was a bill. And the bill mounted to £152, but which was a huge amount of money in those days. Colonel Henry Herbert, the first Earl of Carnarvon, wasn't enormously wealthy, so he was working in collaboration with K.B.T. Brown. He was not going to do it not going to ask K.B.T. Brown to employ the labourers. He was going to employ his own farm labourers. It was far cheaper. So you take this tessellated landscape and the attractive red brick house, and then with K.B.T. Brown's plans for the house, for the lake, and for the landscape around, you were going to create a very different world, and the one which we all enjoy today, 250 years later. We have so much to thank K.B.T. Brown for. It was a huge transformation. He took away the woods to the north of the house. He created a bowl in the lawns facing to the south here. That wasn't there, that was flat. He created sweeps in the hillside, so the ground folded into each other. He created a hill as you come into the park, which was made from the detritus of the lake that he created the other side of the hill, Dunsmuir Lake. So this was done without JCBs, without huge diggers. It was done by men with spades. And when they were creating the lake, having dug the lake out, they then used sheep to pack the earth down before filling it with water. It was done in a bit of a hurry because the first Earl of Carnarvon wanted a result. So things were left in there. It wasn't perfect. Old trees were left in there. So I guess if you were taking a boat through it or swimming through it, you might come across still the remains of some old trees which weren't perfectly removed. But it is a beautiful sweep of water and very much what K.B.T. Brown, in the mood of K.B.T. Brown. The other thing Highclere is really well known for is all its cedar trees. And the cedar trees were planted by both Robert Herbert and then the first Earl of Carnarvon, his nephew. They were brought back from Lebanon in about 1750, 1760. And I think Highclere's got one of the most extraordinary collections of cedars all around compared to any park in this part of England today. Another thing that K.B.T. Brown created was a walled garden. And as you go into the gate above it, it says 1771. So that's when it was created. It faces south and west. And in there it used to be a hive of activity, creating all the fruits, the vegetables for the entire house, the household, and probably the surrounding cottages. Geordie and I weren't quite sure what to do with it, but today we've created a vineyard in there, which we've just planted. So again, K.B.T. Brown's wonderful walled garden is now coming back to life, and I hope in 2 or 3 years' time we'll be able to pick the first grapes to create a champagne, a rosé champagne. We can't call it champagne, of course, a rosé sparkling wine. We're going to call it Chateau Highclere, and I'll be really excited to try the first bottle. Capelty Brown also created a menagerie so that people going for walks could go in and look at some exotic animals, and the whole of the outside of the park was encased in a wavy line of trees. So the 1,000 acres sits within this wavy line of trees. So you're not sure where Highclere's well begins and where it ends. It's giving the sense of aggrandizement and the majesty and the importance of Highclere House as it was, Highclere Castle today, and the Carnarvon family. So they thought that in some ways he was regaining a paradise. Those are many of the words which are associated with Capelty Brown, and he left us the most amazing legacy. He took some of the French ideas and he took them way out. There's not many diaries of what his ideas were, but here is something that he thought. He wrote, "In France, they do not exactly comprehend our ideas in gardening and placemaking, which, when rightly understood, will supply all the elegance and all the comforts which mankind wants in the country, and if right, be exactly fit for the owner, the poet, and the painter. And to produce these effects, there wants a good plan, a good execution, a perfect knowledge of the country and the objects in it, whether natural or artificial, and infinite delicacy in the planting, etc. So much beauty depends on the size of the trees and the colour. So when I look south from Highclere, from the lawns, but with the castle behind me, to one side, to the east in fact, he planted the lighter coloured trees, the limes and the beeches, and to the west he planted the cedar trees, so they produce the most magnificent shadows as the sun set. It's planted in a V with fields to either side, taking your views long into the vista, whereas to the north of the castle, looking towards it, you're enraptured by the folds of the ground, leading your view and your eye towards the castle. It has a wonderful topography, but a lot of it was the creation of man, of Capelty Brown and the first Earl of Carnarvon. And he says that in a good English garden it depends upon principle rather than fashion. I think he associated the French with more fashion. It is immensely beautiful, and I think it's very uplifting. Towards the end of his life, 2 years after, in 1773, he went for a walk with a friend called Hannah, and he said, "I passed 2 hours," she wrote, "I passed 2 hours in the garden with my friend Mr. Brown. He illustrates everything he says about gardening with some literary or grammatical allusion. Now there," he says, pointing with his finger, "I make a comma, and there, where a more decided turn is proper, I make a colon. Where an interruption is desirable to break a view, a parenthesis, now a full stop, and then I begin another subject." So he was an extraordinary man, and he left us a legacy over the centuries, which he actually didn't enjoy, and which we enjoy today. And I think today as well, it's particularly relevant, because in some ways the trees, the shrubs, all that was planted then, gives us the oxygen which we need today, and the trees really do give us oxygen and absorb the carbon dioxide. And if we've learnt nothing else, it's that we need perhaps more oxygen in our world today and perhaps less of the carbon dioxide. So I hope it's been a little excursion around the castle and into the park, and I hope at some point some of you might come and visit and perhaps come for a walk round the park with me. But I've now got time for some questions, and I'm going to rely on Kat to pass the first questions across.
Thank you very much, Lady Carnarvon. Our first question is from Susan, who is in Florida. Is there any historical records of what have been planted in the gardens?
There are historical records, and in fact we've recorded every single tree within the park, and we know when they were planted and what the purpose was behind it. We've also lost a lot of trees. We've had ash die back recently, and before that we lost a huge number of elms, and in fact we are now planning to plant a few more elms. They died of Dutch elm disease, so we're wondering whether these might actually survive this time. And on the lawns next week, I'm going to share with you where the azaleas were planted and some of the specimen and exotic trees were planted slightly nearer the house for those to enjoy.
Thank you. We now have a question from Barry in Hindhead. Have you got any lost gardens similar to those in Helligan in Cornwall?
Well, Barry, I would love to have some more lost gardens. In some ways, Geordie and I have found some of the lost gardens which were subsumed before we began, I suppose, restoring them in old softwood trees. Some of the terraces down beneath the Etruscan temple were entirely lost. So we've done a lot of clearing. We have taken down trees, but we've also planted trees as well. And it's been the most amazing journey. And Geordie and I both love gardening and both love opening the vistas. And sometimes, as Katie Brown said, you close some of them off. So you then take somebody round a corner to share another view. It's a wonderful journey.
I guess this is a related question from Tammy in Western Australia. Have any visitors ever got lost at Highclere, either in the gardens or the parkland?
Well, if they've got lost in the park, we may not have found them again, so I'm not exactly sure. We do sign things, and as more visitors are here, actually, we've expanded our gardens considerably. They were much smaller when Geordie and I took over, and part of our research and our heritage work has been to open up, restore, and make them, I suppose, much more interesting and restorative for people to wander around. So I think today that a wander around the gardens would take you a good hour and a quarter of pleasure and enjoyment, good exercise.
And of course, the garden is the work of many gardeners. Lauren from Florida is asking, how many gardeners do you employ?
Lauren, we don't employ that many gardeners. It's led by Paul, our head gardener, who's very organised and has a great knowledge of the soil and how to dig, and then George and I really get behind him as the plants men. He's got 2 assistants, and we've also got a young apprentice trainee. So that's all, but they've got good mowers, and we sometimes have some contractors in to help cut all the hedges, and that saves a huge amount of time, actually. So we look at who can do what jobs best.
Lady Carnarvon, we now have a question from Mike in California. Were those tulips picked from the garden on your table there?
Oh, thank you. They were picked from the garden by Hannah for me earlier on today. And they're nearly over, but they're so beautiful. And my husband plants the tulips. He tends to buy the bulbs and I tend to buy the shrubs.
We now have a question from Jeff in San Jose. Which are the more exotic plants or trees in the grounds?
Jeff, thank you. In some ways, the most obvious exotic tree is the cedar of Lebanon. It obviously is there are wonderful woods, or were wonderful woods and forests of cedars of Lebanon in Lebanon, and it's part of their national flag. Sadly, they have been obviously badly not taken down, and they are disintegrating given all the different crises and wars surrounding Lebanon at the moment, and many of them are going or have gone. These cones from which these cedars of Lebanon were grown were brought back by Bishop Pocock, who travelled to the Middle East in the 1740s, and he brought back an awful lot of cones, and Geordie's ancestor was given 400 cones to plant here. He grew them in a nursery, and when they were about 20 years old, some of them 15, 20 years old, they were then planted out. So some of them were planted out straight away. So he was always growing them on to preserve them. They were regarded as very precious, and they've given us an extraordinary stature today. They grow much taller here than in the Lebanon because of all the water and the rain. So that also means branches then fall off when they're covered in snow. In Lebanon, because they don't grow as big, they tend to survive longer. But they're mentioned in the Bible. Tutankhamun's coffin was made from cedar of Lebanon, and it's been a revered tree, a gift from God, if you like, for centuries, for millennium.
Thank you. We now have a question from Stephen in Rhode Island. Do you have any follies on the estate?
Stephen, we have about 6 follies left. Before Capability Brown, there were 12 follies here at least. And one thing he did was break down all the follies in order to create the naturalistic landscape we enjoy today. which is probably quite lucky, but there's still all of the 6 follies left, the things that we try to restore and maintain. There's Jackdaw's Castle on the east lawn, where we're going to go next week, and behind me on the hill is Heaven's Gate, which is one of George's and my favourite follies. I think it's so named from a Shakespeare sonnet, Sonnet 29, which begins, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state." There's the middle 2 couplets, which are always worth remembering, that you're desiring this man's art and that man's scope, contented least with what you most enjoy, and it's about learning to be like the skylark, flying from sullen earth to heaven's gate. So it's a beautiful folly, and that's why I think it's called Heaven's Gate, and you look up towards heaven beyond it. And when you're up there at Heaven's Gate, it is the most heavenly view. I always feel so lucky to be there.
Thank you. We now have Clay from Texas, who is asking, will you ever plant more cedar trees? I love them.
Clay, we have planted quite a few cedar trees. Geordie and I are following Capability Brown strategy, so they're planted to the west and in the distance. So perhaps in 100 years' time, whoever's standing here where I am will be able to see them as they rise up and then cut across the landscape there. We've planted more on the exit or entrance, the original Capability Brown exit or entrance, where some of the oldest cedar trees have since fallen. So we've planted another 4 there, which were in fact gifts from some amazing American friends who came to stay with us. And there's no greater gift than some trees or some shrubs. So, and around each of the trees they've given me, we've planted a poem or a saying or a quote from Longfellow or other American writers.
We now have a question from Karen in Kentucky. Have you ever visited Biltmore?
I haven't yet visited Biltmore. I would love to, but Mrs. Pickering and her family have actually visited Highclere, so we're in communication, and I'm in awe of what they've achieved. It's an amazing house. It's very much the beating heart of that part of America, and it's created a wonderful custodianship of a heritage house.
We now have a question from Leonita in California. Are there any excursions to your castle from cruise ships?
Leonita, there are excursions from cruise ships, above all from Viking cruises. We have a great programme with Viking to give them priority access before or after the cruises that so many people enjoy going on, whether it's the river cruises or indeed the ocean cruises. And I'm very much looking forward to going back on a boat. It's so comfortable, and I love their spas.
Perhaps this is one of the final questions. We've got a question from Susan in Chicago. Have all your family and friends and staff managed to stay healthy during this time?
Thank you. As far as we know, we have stayed healthy, and none of us, as far as we are aware, have been ill since we were locked down, if you like, on March the 23rd. And we've tried to follow rigorously all the government suggestions and propositions of not going out unless we really have to, in order to beat the infection, so that as soon as we all can, we can all begin to move a little bit more and take steps beyond an entire lockdown. And it is a global challenge. I'm sure with our extraordinary resources that I hope that we will win through with vaccines, which I suspect we must do in the end. But in the past, if you think about in Victorian times, there was diphtheria and cholera and typhoid, and we passed through that with the help of vaccines, and I'm sure we will do the same. You have to be optimistic whilst thinking always of those who have suffered more than we have in terms of the loss of those they much love or of much loved friends. So, and then to say thank you to those who've cared for them and been with them in their hour of need.
Our final question now is from Kim in Boston. She says, your stewardship of the land is absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you. It's very much a joint stewardship with my husband. So we very much do it together, and we love the land, the beauty it gives us, and the trees. So I want to say thank you so much for all your questions. I hope you've enjoyed a little bit about Capability Brown. Next week we're going to be in the azaleas, which I hope will be in full flower by then, scented and beautiful, a riot of colour. We're by Jackdaw's Castle as well, and then we're going to come inside and share a few stories from the drawing room, which I know you'll recognise from Downton Abbey, and we're going to tell you a few stories about Geordie's great-grandmother Almina, because she was the one who decorated the drawing room in 1895. So I'll see you next week.